Okay, so hello everyone. This is Victorian Vanguard, and I am your host Ritam Datto. And this will going to be the 25th episode of Victorian Vanguard. And today we have Emma Woodhouse. She is a teacher and historical novelist and non-fiction writer whose books are based on real Victorian women. She is currently writing her second non-fiction book and has just completed her fifth novel. Emma has taken part in conferences, symposiums, discussions, the ethics behind fictionalizing real people. She is especially interested in Victorian working class history and unearthing and re exploring the voices of forgotten and overlooked women. And today she will going to talk on the topic fleshing out Victorian imagination, an exploration of the diaries of Hannah Culwick in comparison to the fictionalized fallen woman, Esther Waters. So over to you, and we are really glad that you accepted and you came here for the presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if I can actually work out how to do this. Just find my PowerPoint here. Got a lot of tabs open, so it's taking a little while. Here we go.
Okay, it's visible.
Okay. Fantastic. So if we go to slideshow, oh dear. I'm going to try and get it to from the current slide. Is that working?
Not really. I mean, it is only showing the main page.
Okay, let's just see if I can get it to work.
But it's visible. I mean, if you can
Yeah.
keep it like that. Yeah.
Okay, let's go for it like this then. So yes, thank you so much for having me. And my paper is called Fleshing Out the Victorian Imagination, an exploration of the diaries of Hannah Culwick in comparison to the fictionalised fallen woman, Esther Waters. So today we will explore the relationships of two Victorian working class women, Esther Waters, a fictional character, and Hannah Culwick, a real woman who detailed her relationship in her diaries, which were written for an audience of one man alone, her lover, barrister, solicitor, and then civil servant Arthur Munby. Both extraordinary texts were written to reveal the realism of working class Victorian sexuality to their audience, and both pushed societal boundaries in different ways. Through comparing the exploits of the fictional Esther and the real Hannah, two women whose stories defied the prevailing narratives of the time, the Victorian literary landscape, the imagination of the Victorians when it comes to the fallen woman can be explored anew. But first, a little about the social and literary context. Exploring the Victorian imagination regarding the sexuality of working class women, we often meet the phrase fallen woman. Although it's hard to pinpoint a specific date when the phrase began to be used, there's evidence that it was well established by the mid-1800s, for example in Elizabeth Gaskell's Ruth, published in 1853. She was a fallen woman, and yet she was pure in heart. Gaskell was writing from a Christian-inflected moral standpoint, seeking an audience to witness her message of redemption over punishment. She'd previously also written Mary Barton, whose aunt was seduced by an army officer and who takes up sex work in order to survive, losing her baby and ultimately growing dependent on alcohol, becoming homeless. Gaskell's fallen woman narrative had an agenda. She was offering a moral, spiritual message of caution to the working class while simultaneously critiquing society's treatment of them, and she wasn't alone. Numerous novels arose during the Victorian period, telling cautionary tales of women who were brought low, fallen from the grace of God like Eve in the Garden of Eden, succumbing to temptation through their unsanctified carnal knowledge of man. Yet the phrase fallen woman was not a specific label. Houses for the rehabilitation of women were created in pious and moral efforts to reform women who had borne children out of wedlock, or to create socially segregated institutions where prostitutes were encouraged to welcome God into their lives and reform. Women of both of these states were indiscriminately referred to as fallen women, fallen from grace, fallen from the rigid expectations placed upon a woman by a society that sought to oppress them. In addition to this, for a woman to experience sexual desire, even a married woman, was often deemed unnatural. Physician James Cowles Pritchard, whose work was considered pioneering in the field of psychiatry, believed that women were prone to lapses in morals that were indicative of mental illness. In his deposition, a treatise on insanity and other disorders affecting the mind, he wrote, Moral insanity is a form of mental derangement in which the intellectual faculties appear to have suffered little or no injury, while the disorder is manifested principally or alone in the state of the feelings, temper, habits, and moral dispositions. Moral insanity was a concept that described a perfectly intelligent person having lost control of their morals and emotions. The term was used to confine women to asylums who were considered nymphomaniacs. Women were supposed to marry, conceive, and bear offspring, and their enjoyment of the act itself was often unexpected, distasteful, and sometimes intimidating for the men around them. It is from this narrative of Victorian sexuality, exacerbated by novels that perpetuated the immorality of women and sex, fueled by political, religious, moral, or social agenda, that Esther Waters and the Diaries of Hannah Culwick are extraordinary. Esther Waters is a novel by George Moore, published in 1894, wherein the eponymous main character falls from grace and is depicted in her struggles to cope with the aftermath. It is a lesser-known text, possibly due to the decline in popularity of Moore's work, which in turn contributed to his inability to accept that a piece was finished, becoming an inveterate reviser, taking work that had been published and editing, revising, and stylistically changing the content. Esther Waters is also a rare British Victorian fallen woman who, through Moore's determination to present her through a lens of realism, was not written with Christian, feminist, or political messages at the heart, as other more popular works were, such as Elizabeth Gaskell's Ruth or Mary Barton, or Eliza Lynn's Laura in The Outcast. Moore was influenced in his writing style by realism. An admirer and associate of Émile Zola, he believed that realism rather than sentimentalism was paramount, and he expressed this in his literary memoir, Confessions of a Young Man, published in 1888. I determined to write of life as I saw it, not as I should like it to be, to tell the truth, even though it were not pretty. Moore's stance to portray the reality he perceived around him, rather than create a novel seeped in religious or political overtures, was the reason I chose this text to engage with. Moore's declared stance on writing was in a pamphlet entitled Literature at Nurse, or Circulating Morals, wherein he averred towards the novel of observation, which should include study of life and manners, life's passions and duties, and ought to reflect the nervous, passionate life of the era. Moore suffered from the censorship of his work, particularly by Moody's circulating library, who refused to stock two of his novels, allegedly because two ladies wrote to complain that they were essentially threats to public decency through his portrayals of questionable morality or poor taste. And Moody's purchasing or declining a novel could make or break any author, especially those who push the boundaries in their depictions of sexual relationships. Despite these setbacks, Moore remained dedicated to the ideals of realism, declaring that a novelist is not a moralist, he is an artist, and his business is to tell the truth about life, adding, "We want books that deal with life as it is, not as it should be." In Moore's imagination, there was no need to shape Esther's story in a way that was intended to critique society's treatment of these women, nor to form a narrative arc that saw her gain punishment or redemption. In the preface of the 1894 edition of Esther Waters, Moore wrote that he wanted to portray Esther as a rough page torn from life. For the purposes of this paper, all reference to Esther's story will be from the original 1894 edition, maintaining Moore's initial version of the story without the edits he later made, which may have been influenced by the disappointing reception from booksellers and libraries. Briefly then, an overview of the novel. Esther is a Plymouth Brethren follower, a devoutly religious girl who goes into service due to her stepfather's insistence and his violent outbursts. At the Barfields' house, Woodview, where she works as a kitchen maid, she is exposed to horse racing and gambling, not only by the other servants but by her employer, who has his own racehorse and who breeds racehorses, and she struggles to cope with the strict morals of her religion in the face of such profligate and hedonistic living, which filters down from the Barfields to all the staff. The other maids call her a creeping Jesus for praying, and her moral conflicts are compounded when she meets the footman, William Latch. He induces her to bet on the horses, and they begin courting. Esther is happy, caught up in the world of Woodview, growing further from her Plymouth Brethren roots, until the night of a ball to celebrate a race won by Mr. Barfield's horse, when she sees the jockey, who they call the Demon, staggering about helplessly drunk. Then she felt that all this dancing, drinking, and kissing in the arbours was very wicked, and that she ought not to have allowed herself to have been persuaded into going to the ball. Shortly afterwards, another man is accused of something improper, and rows erupt. The happiness of the ball is over. Yet instead of warning Esther away from the life she has partaken of, these interruptions make Esther much more attached to William, and within a short while her fate is sealed by William's decisive action and the alcohol she's drunk, which makes her resolve weak. One evening, putting his pipe aside, William threw his arms around her and whispered that she was his wife. The words sounded delicious in her ears, but she could hardly hear what he said after. A sort of weakness seemed to come over her. It must be the beer she had drunk. She wished she had not taken that last glass. She could not struggle with him. Under the influence of alcohol and with William's delicious words contributing to moral insanity, Esther loses her virginity. Afterwards, she flees William's presence, filled with religious guilt and shame, and refuses to speak to him. Rejected by her, William runs away with a female member of the Barfield household. Esther is left pregnant. Moore gives us the possibility that were she less religious, and had she been more forgiving towards William sooner, her story might have been an easier one. Unlike the fallen women of other novels of the era, Esther's religious zeal has sealed her downfall in the eyes of society. Esther hides her pregnancy for 7 months before being discovered and dismissed by her mistress. After the birth, she is offered a role as a wet nurse, sending her baby out to live with Mrs. Spires, who, it transpires, is a baby farmer. Spires tells poor mothers that she will look after and even find adoptive parents for their children whilst the mothers work, but instead neglects them. And when Esther confronts her, Spires tells her that the death of the child is a mercy for both mother and baby. The inclusion of such morally reprehensible acts in a Victorian novel was certainly enough to offend the sensibilities of readers who might never have been confronted by this sort of dark realism before. Not only this, but when Esther realises that her son will die if he stays with Mrs. Spires, and she takes him away, walking away from her employment too, she questions her decision. In the delirium of her misery, she asked herself if it would not have been better, perhaps, if she had left him with Mrs. Spires. What indeed had the little fellow to live for? For the refined reader, including those who used Moody's circulating library, this would have portrayed the questionable morality that saw Moore's work censored. Notably, 2 years after Esther Waters was published, Amelia Dyer, the infamous baby farmer, was arrested, tried and hanged, having been convicted of only one murder, that of Doris Marmon. However, the scale of her activities over nearly 3 decades suggests she may have been responsible for the deaths of several hundred infants. Esther's moral questioning regarding whether her son would be better off dead demonstrates her desperate poverty and her emotionally broken state, which, though upsetting for readers, was realistic for thousands of working-class women around the country who had been in the same situation. By the end of the book, Esther has spent 8 years struggling to find food and to pay to have her boy raised by Mrs. Lewis while she works to pay for his keep. She's finally engaged and married to a religious man, Fred Parsons, who offers her a peaceful and godly future when William Latch walks back into her life, utterly ignorant of the fact that she bore his baby. She's failed and childless, and he still loves Esther, becoming more persistent when he realises that there was a child born of their brief union. Esther's tale does not have the dramatic outcome of Sorrel, who is sentenced to exploitation in George Eliot's Adam Bede, nor does it have the redemptive ending, for example, of Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Promising to marry Esther once his divorce comes through, William invites her to come and live with him, and Esther makes a practical choice, although even in this, we see that she is driven by the physical attraction she feels towards William. She tries to think of Fred, but William's great, square shoulders had come between her and this meagre little man. She sighed and felt once again that her will was overborne by a force which she could not control or understand. This description of her emotions reignites the concept of moral insanity of Pritchard's A Treatise on Insanity and Other Disorders Affecting the Mind. Esther agrees to marry William, despite her misgivings, not only due to her feelings of attraction towards him, but also in part to the money and stability that their son might gain from their marriage. Giving up her possibility for redemption within a more religious union with Fred, she marries William and goes to live and work in his pub where he takes bets on the races. William, however, is not Esther's happy ending. He ultimately succumbs to his old gambling ways, making their lives fraught with losses, then dies of tuberculosis. Moore's ending carries no moral message. Religion has not saved Esther, nor redeemed her in the eyes of society. The promise of redemption from marrying the father of her child promotes only more misery and poverty. It's only through William's death and her return to Woodview and Mrs. Barfield to work as a servant once more that Esther finds peace. Her ending is ethically radical in that she and her son are consumed into the world that brought her low, and they exist within it whilst William is alive. And then once he is dead, Esther returns to her original state, a servant, once more. There's no epiphany or judgment in the ending. She's brought up her son, and that is all that can be said. She neither suffers nor triumphs. She just is. A side note here for anyone planning to read the book: after the first edition, Moore undertook 4 subsequent edits of Esther's story. In 1899, 1917, 1920 and 1931, Moore altered his original in ways that incited critic Rachel Bowlby to note that he had softened the harshness of the original, making Esther's story more emotionally resonant and less starkly naturalistic. These later changes altered his original, perhaps turning it into a book less likely to be censored by vendors. Yet his intentions in creating Esther's story stands apart from the fallen women narratives of the 19th century because it was intended to present real issues and real experiences of fallen women and the struggles they suffered, and nothing more. Esther Waters was a fallen woman, but the delivery of her realist narrative is an extraordinary one for the time. Now let us contrast the fictional Esther Waters with a real woman who created a fallen woman narrative from her own experiences, Hannah Culwick. Born in the rural village of Shifnal in Shropshire on the 26th of May 1833, Hannah was the daughter of a saddler and a lady's maid, but her father suffered losses that meant the family was very poor. One of 5 children, Hannah began to work at 8 years old, working in various employments as a servant, then later as a nursemaid. By the age of 14, she'd lost both of her parents. By 17, she was working for Lady Louisa Coates, who took her during the season to London as her kitchen maid. And it was while she was in London during her second season there in 1854, at the age of 21, that she met a solicitor named Arthur Munby, a gentleman who enjoyed the company and the dirt and strength of low-class working women. Their relationship was often long distance, with Munby in London and Hannah taking positions in London and at other times Margate or Brighton. Munby requested that Hannah create for him a piece of work that would later provide historians with evidence that their relationship broke social boundaries and transcended the fallen woman trope altogether. He asked her to write diaries and post them to him. In these diaries, Hannah was to detail her days, including what time she rose, the work she did, and the people she spoke to. Hannah willingly, at least at first, acquiesced. In all, she wrote 17 diaries from 1854 up to 1873. To understand the roots of their relationship, we must consider Hannah's mindset when she began the diaries. Hannah's concept of romance and how it related to her station in life was perhaps primed by having watched a musical named The Death of Sardanapalus, based on Byron's play, shortly before their first meeting. This was Hannah's first trip to the theatre, where the story of the Greek slave girl Myrrha, who was in love with the king and whose affections were returned, had unfolded before her eyes. Myrrha was no ordinary slave. She maintained an independent, often outspoken personality, refusing to be led by a man even when that man was her king. Munby became the king to Hannah's Myrrha. To further stress their relationship in social status, Hannah referred to him as Massa, a colonialist reference to slavery. She saw herself as his slave and he was her master, and Hannah believed in signs, in destiny, writing that she had seen Munby's face in the fire before they had ever met. At tea one day I saw a man's face as clearly as could be in the fire. I thought it was such a nice manly face with a moustache. I little thought I should see such a face, much less to love such a face, but in 54 I did see it. This extract is from the beginning of Hannah's diaries, where she details a brief history of her life thus far, including meeting Munby. She was walking back to her employment after meeting with her brother. On the way to Grosvenor Street, a gentleman spoke to me and I answered him. That was Massa's face, as I'd seen in the fire, but I didn't know it again till a good while after. The entry is brief, but clearly for Hannah, the experience of their meeting was due to some sort of preordained destiny, predicted in the flames. Sadly, it is impossible to explore Munby's own diary entries of their first meeting to gain a clearer picture of what was said or how he chose her of all the women he passed that day. Munby destroyed segments of his diaries before he was bold enough to recognise his relationship with Hannah publicly, later admitting, "All the excised passages in this and other volumes had reference, so far as I can remember, to my darling Hannah. They described the hours we spent together, the training and teaching that I gave her, and the work, often of the lowest and most servile kind, which she, a maid of all work, of her own accord did for me to show her love in her own way." The couple both knew that their relationship would mean social ostracism were they discovered, although of course it would be worse for Hannah, who would be considered a fallen woman, despite the probability that their relationship was not consummated for a number of years, with Munby writing of her stopping over with him in 1862, "Pure she came and pure she went." The repercussions for Munby would have been certainly less severe, but Hannah was still forced to hide beneath the bed should his landlady appear and find them together. "I crept under the bed and lay there till he called me out. I felt like a dog, and it pleased me." And it is with phrases and sentiments such as this that we can start to question the validity of what Hannah was writing. Was this sentiment true? Was she really pleased to feel like a dog beneath the bed, or was it written for the benefit of Munby? Did Hannah worry that he might feel guilty about how she was treated, writing that she was pleased by it to set his mind at ease and ensure that no factors of guilt might induce him to end their relationship? Indeed, Hannah consistently wrote about how dirty she liked to get in her work and her enjoyment of being treated in a lowly manner. Part of this stemmed from Munby's preference for hard-working, low-class servant girls, and partly due to Munby's teachings. He sought to teach her not only to read, but to instruct her regarding morality, having formed a very certain idea about the moral differences between the working class and those who are considered above them. It is probable that Hannah Culwick wrote, and, when she saw Munby, acted in a manner to maintain his interest in her. Her diaries were initially an act of devotion to pander to the whims of a man obsessed with the idea of salvation through toil and degradation. The harder Hannah worked, the more angelic and worthy of his love she believed Munby thought her. One such example comes in the extract from 16th of October 1863, when in the evening, once the fire had died down and the chimney had cooled, Hannah detailed her work. Stripped myself quite naked and put a pair of old boots on and tied an old duster over my hair, and then I got up into the chimney with a brush. There was a lot of soot, and it was soft and warm. I sat on the beam that goes across the middle and crossed my legs along it, and I was quite safe and comfortable and out of sight. I swept lots of soot down, and it come all over me, and I sat there for 10 minutes or more. And I lay on the hearth in the soot a minute or two thinking, and I wished rather that Massa could see me. Would Hannah really have undertaken such work naked without her audience of one? In the past, when small boys had been employed by chimney sweeps, they had indeed been expected to do it naked, so that clothes were not dirtied or snagged, and so that the heat made them work faster. But on that occasion, Hannah was not alone. The nephew of one of the servants, Fred Cook, was in the house, and she made sure to mention it in her diary. Did she, in fact, do it at all, or was it a fabrication written down for Munby's delectation? It is important to understand that since their relationship began, Hannah had spent hours listening to Munby's rhetoric regarding a moral code for the working classes. I've taught her to see that her strength and honesty are virtues, though they're not the virtues of ladies. She now knows that her dirt and labour are noble because they are real. Hannah internalised these teachings, noting, "I feel I'm better in the kitchen than in the parlour. I belong to work, and I'm proud to be strong and dirty, if it's for him and for right." Hannah rubbed her skin with soot and blacklead in order to appear all the more filthy in her work, to extremes where Munby sometimes himself was repulsed or embarrassed by her efforts. I was now a regular drudge, and my hands were grimed with dirt and big and red with the frost, and Massa told me to come to him in my dirt. I did once or twice, and walked up the Strand with dirty frock and striped apron and my old bonnet and hands and arms and face begrimed with dirt, so that once I think he really pitied me and never wished me to come out so again. Hannah took her dirt to extremes. She added layers of dirt to her skin to please him. Could she have added layers of dirt to her writing too? She believed that Munby wanted to see her thoroughly caked in filth as a visual representation of her hard-working, loyal purity, and that's what she unflinchingly gave him both in person and in her diaries, whether it was truly realistic or not. Hannah also defied expectations of Victorian societal propriety, in that she had no expectations of Munby marrying her, making what society would call an honest woman of her. Yet she also held no illusions regarding her own worth. She was a working-class woman, and she did not wish to rise in status, proud of her work and secure in her position in society. Her strength was obvious in her reactions to her employers and her others around her. Hannah was not a woman who would respond passively to situations she was displeased with. For example, in 1860, when her employer told her she was expected to go to church every Sunday with the rest of the household. "I don't hold with going to church just to please them. I work honest all week, and that's enough. I won't be made to sit among them like I'm one of them." In fact, Hannah walked out of this particular employment because this expectation had been put upon her. She left jobs when dissatisfied with the terms, even when there was nothing else on the horizon. Sometimes, despite her slavish symbolism and declared servitude of Munby, she even went against his wishes. For example, at the beginning of 1863, when Munby sent Hannah a note saying he should go away if he didn't get my diary a Saturday night. Hannah had not corresponded as much as Munby wanted her to, openly stating that she hated writing the diaries. "I like cleaning boots, but I hate to sit down and write." Nevertheless, the diaries were an expectation, and she knew better than to completely rebel against them for fear that Munby might desert her. In any diary, let alone one which is to be read by a lover, a selective set of experiences might be documented, those that are the most meaningful for the reader, with some inevitable exaggeration or downplaying. And over time, Hannah began to consider the content of her diaries further and make them work in her favour to manipulate her reader. There is a perceptible shift observable in the content of Hannah's diaries over time. She was writing not to satisfy his whims, but for her own agenda. The diaries became a tool whereby, from her intimate knowledge of Munby, she could incite jealousy or love, devotion or pity. Stanley writes, initially they were written for Munby. Later they were written much more for Hannah herself, and she used them to accomplish many purposes. In changing ways, she increasingly used the diaries to gain greater influence within and over their relationship. The diaries became emotional leverage, a self-authorship of eroticized suffering to gain narrative control. Interestingly, however, Hannah makes no real allusions to intercourse between herself and Munby, and this is backed by Munby's own diaries that describe the temptations he was forced to battle when she slept in his rooms. Some scholars agree that penetrative sex was unlikely. For example, one historian concluded that after some 18 years, sex was unlikely. For example, after some 18 years, they never seem to have had sex in its conventional definition, although there were certainly sadomasochistic and masochistic tendencies in the relationship. Historian Helen Merrick agrees, using this extract from Munby's later diaries to promote her theory, whereas Hannah Culwick, servant, has been for 45 years and upwards beloved by me with a pure and honourable love and not otherwise. The lack of sexual detail or even intimation in both Hannah and Munby's diaries has promoted scholars to presume that what has been described in terms of a sadomasochistic and fetishistic relationship was likely sexless, at least until the diaries ended. These same scholars have long ascertained that Hannah was a fetishist. However, if we consider her diaries as a work of creative non-fiction, where she might embellish, alter, ignore and fabricate stories to satisfy what she thought Munby wanted, we can begin to unravel the narrative in new ways. We have an extraordinary concept of the fallen woman. Hannah defied the fallen woman trope as her power over Munby grew even after the diaries had ended. She'd never wanted children of her own. When at last, in their older years, Munby wanted to marry her, Hannah was not convinced that it was the right thing to do and refused to entertain the prospect of marriage at first. Unlike Esther Waters, Hannah did not entertain any form of moral insanity. She was calculated and determined and knew what she wanted without deviation. At last, when they married in 1873 by special licence in Clerkenwell Parish Church, Hannah's diaries ended, but her influence over the relationship and her own sense of worth did not. Even after their marriage, she resisted taking his name and refused to give up her work, despite societal expectation and the expectations of her husband. When at last she did settle down with him, their marriage was not a success, and after 4 years, Hannah's unquenchable spirit rebelled against Munby, and they parted in 1877, existing separately until around 1884 to 1885, by which time Hannah knew that she was in control of the relationship, allowing it to continue on her terms instead of his. Munby bequeathed both his own and Hannah's diaries to the British Museum, stipulating that the boxes containing the diaries, along with their letters to each other and photographs, were not opened until 1950. The British Museum refused to accept the donation due to his request, and the boxes were taken to Trinity College Library, Cambridge. Munby was clearly aware of the questionable morality and socially transgressive nature of his and Hannah's relationship, perhaps hoping that a future progressive society might accept it more readily. The stories of both Hannah and Esther are unique. Although Esther Waters is more typical of a fallen woman narrative, suffering and bearing a child out of wedlock, both narratives demonstrate a refusal to follow societal expectation and the literary moral tropes of the time, and both redefined historical narratives of the era regarding the fallen woman through a lens of realism that caused one to be censored and the other to be kept a secret for 50 years. These two fallen woman narratives avoid the moral, religious, and political polemic of other more well-known fallen woman works, offering naturalist and sentimental visions of what it meant to be a fallen woman and demonstrating that the Victorian imagination regarding love, sex and relationships was deeper and more insightful than the popular texts of the era demonstrated. It's important for us to unearth and re-explore the psychological and sociological aspects of these forgotten or overlooked narratives through a modern lens in order to fully understand the fallen woman in the Victorian era and allow agency to those whose experiences were censored and thrust to the darkened recesses marked questionable morality or poor taste. Those are my references. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Emma. It was a wonderful presentation. And I really love the way you have defined the following women. I'm Shauli. I'm one of your coordinators. I'm so sorry I couldn't join earlier because of some health issues. So, the idea of the fallen women, to be precise, the drowned women, is something that is a very quintessential Victorian trope that has attracted me for a very long time. So I really love the way you defined the terms and the characters, how they define the term, and through the lens of realism. That is something that is very fascinating. So I wanted to ask you one question, if you don't mind. So
Yeah.
you see the paper mentions that your paper mentions that Kaluvik is wearing a slave band, and they are like evoking the colonialist imagery. So how
Yes.
might this practice be situated within the wider Victorian discourse of empire, race, and servitude? And do you think that this analysis risk underplaying these dynamics by focusing primarily on class and gender?
Yes, there's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? So, yes, Hannah did evoke colonialist symbolism and imagery, and when I first discovered her, I found that quite hard to stomach, because I did feel that it undermined the whole colonialist issue and slavery. But then I had to consider her education and consider her as a person and how far removed she was from really understanding the wider aspects of that, in her daily life. Um, and I also had to consider how she was sort of primed by observing that slave and king relationship in the Byron play that she saw just before meeting Munby. So I really had um, to kind of balance that sort of those issues within myself before kind of getting to know Hannah a little bit better and looking into her history, because that was something that I found quite um, unsettling at first. Um, when we look at her relationship with Munby, Munby was very, very controlling. I mean, the whole writing of the diaries was a form of control. It was a form of possession. It was a form of uh, we'd think of that as probably an abusive relationship in modern terms, because he was checking up on her all the time. He wanted to know who she'd spoken to, what she'd done, um, on those sorts of terms. And he'd also taken upon himself to educate her. And we know that obviously she started work at the age of 8, and Munby's education helped her to learn to read, helped her to progress her writing, and also that was where she got more ideas about the moral structure of their relationship, and about the sort of he really pushed the idea that being dirty and being in servitude was a way to be pure, was a way to be godly, was a way to be loyal. And that was what Hannah was receiving. That was what Hannah was learning about society. So she was very, very blinkered, and he made sure that she was very, very blinkered. Um, would you like to repeat any parts of the question I haven't answered, because it was
Okay, no, no,
a
no.
very long question?
You have answered it quite well, and also in a very detailed manner. So I really like that. You see, Hannah is defining the idea of the fallen women trope that Esther embodies in Moore's novel. Yet her diaries were written under the influence and often for the gaze of Arthur Munby, right?
Yeah.
So I was just thinking to myself that does Kalvik's self representation truly subvert the fallen women narrative, or does it become another variation of the same trope, and which is shaped to fit Munby's desires and the Victorian literary conventions that you already have answered in one of your questions? So, if you would like to elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think initially she was very, very under his power. And she obviously believed it was her destiny to be under his power because she'd seen him in the fire. And she clearly believed that that was a sort of preordained meeting, and so forth. So, however, she was also primed by this idea of this slave girl Mirror, who was quite outspoken still and still retained her ability to think for herself. And so although Hannah was initially very, very much swayed by Munby and his teachings, over time she began to rebel from that a little bit. And there were episodes in her diary where she would add things that displeased him and that she would have known would displease him. And that she began to be able to manipulate his reactions to her through her diary. Hannah was very aware that Munby was not faithful to her in that, whether they were sexually active or not, Munby spent a lot of time with other women, particularly other working class women, and Hannah was aware of this. And so Hannah started to use her diaries to include things that might make him a little bit jealous, or that might create more of a sort of eroticized version of herself through for example, the extract that I read out about her getting naked and being in the chimney. So Hannah grew to take control of that situation. So she sort of escaped almost the fallen woman kind of possibility of what could happen to her by taking control. And I think that was a really extraordinary thing for her to do, because many women would have succumbed to Munby's teachings and that would have been it. And Hannah stepped out of that. Hannah transcended that through her own intellect, really. And you know, Arthur Munby tried to educate her, and he clearly did a good enough job for her to start to think for herself, which, you know, I definitely applaud. And so I believe initially she was a fallen woman. If they'd have been found out, she would have been very much a fallen woman in the eyes of society.
Yeah, that is very well explicated and very well answered. Thank you so much, Emma. Now I think the floor is open to the audience if they want to ask you something as well.
Okay, before opening this to the audience, I have a quick question. And thank you so much for the lecture. It was a wonderful lecture. And I also like the fact when you mentioned George Eliot's Adam Mead's reference, which is also quite useful. So my question is very different from the actual issue. And the question is like, what might the comparison between Culwick and Esther reveal about the politics of audience? And what do I mean by that is like, Esther read by a broader public. However, Culwick's diaries are kind of confined to only Munby, right? So,
Yeah.
how this shape our perception of each woman's story? I mean, if you see that from that point of view.
Both are sort of rooted in realism. Esther's story is rooted in a realism that actually the public found quite hard to stomach, and I think that a lot of Moore's writing was. And due to the reception of his novels, I said in the talk, he became obsessed with editing his work. And when you read parts of the original 1894 text and you read his later text and you put them together, you can see the differences. So, for example, in the extract that I read out about when Esther loses her virginity, the part you saw on the slide was from the 1894 version. Esther was drunk. In the later version, Esther was not drunk, and Esther swoons away and wakes up unable to sort of get away from him until he's finished what he's doing. And so he changed her, and he made her later on a little bit more kind of maybe innocent or naive, whereas in the original text, you know, she's quite immersed in that life around her. And clearly back then, when in 1894, when it was released, he felt that the reception of it was altered because of that. And yet it was a realistic way to be. It was realistic for a servant to have a drink and sort of go off into the arbours, and you know, it's humans at the end of the day. But I think he was very worried about that reception by the sort of public and by the booksellers, who obviously could censor him. And when we come to Hannah, and obviously she's writing for that audience of one, it's a very, very different reception. It's a very, very different way of writing. And I think she was hyper aware, particularly over time, of her audience. Whereas George Moore was less able to write to what the audience wanted, but that wasn't his intention. So whereas Moore did not wish to please anybody with his writing, or he did not wish to moralize with his writing, Hannah was writing to please somebody, but over time she wrote to please herself more than her audience. She wrote to manipulate that audience rather than to necessarily give it what it wanted. So that it's two very different ways of writing for sure. Is there anything about your question I haven't answered? Sorry.
Thank you so much for this response. Now the floor is open to the audience. So if you have any question, then you can definitely ask right now, or you can raise your hand, and or you can write it on the chat box. I really like the entire lecture and the comparison. Uh, Both the stories are very different, not so different. I mean, they are connected, and okay. Okay, since no one is responding, I have another. Okay, I think we have a question in the chat box. Okay, so Aditi Joshi has written, I really enjoyed the presentation. I think this is the first I have encountered the fallen woman trope in the form of a working class woman. Do you think her class position plays into the ending Moore gives her, as opposed to the more fatal conclusion of her virtuous fallen women like Emma Bovary, Anna Karenina, or Lady Dedlock?
Yeah. So there were obviously working class fallen women novels that did end in a very fatalistic way. So, for example, in Adam Bede, Hetty Sorrell was tried for infanticide, initially charged with murder, and then she ended up being transported. So you did have those very kind of dramatic, very moral, very seeped in punishment, and how can we find salvation, or can we not find salvation? Is it a matter of punishment at the end? In other novels where there were fallen women, there was often punishment or redemption. It was one or the other. For Esther, she just carried on being, and I think that Moore chose a working class character to write about rather than sort of bourgeois character, because that was what he saw all around him. He was an associate of Emile Zola, and if you know the works of Zola, Zola wrote some incredible novels about the working class. Germinal just absolutely blew my mind with the realism and the suffering that the French people underwent, and that sort of working class, that was where George Moore was concentrated. So I don't think for George Moore as a writer, I don't think there was ever going to be a concept of him considering a sort of middle class or upper class character. It had to be the working class. Esther's ending, she's almost gone full circle. She's gone back to where she started. So she's not risen. She's ended up where she began. She suffered and suffered and suffered and suffered, and then she's ended up no better, no worse. She just merely is. I think that's what I wrote in the presentation, and I think that Moore didn't set out for her to. I think he wanted that sort of. He wanted to tell the story. He didn't want there to be any ups or downs. Yeah, I don't know I hope that's answered your question. I think that it was inevitable she had to be working class, and I think that the nature of his writing meant that there would be no sort of fatalistic ending for her, because he just wanted to present what life was like. So thank you for that question. It's a good question. Thank you.
I hope that answers the question pretty well. We have another question, and yes, it does actually. Okay, so the second question is, very nice presentation. Can we associate this presentation with the idea of Magdalene laundries.
Yeah. So we're talking here about those places where women would drop their babies off. There's been a lot in the news recently, hasn't there, about women would drop their babies off and potentially nuns or people would look after them, but actually those babies were left to die. And Amelia Dyer did this for a living in the 1890s, and there was a lot of it about, definitely. The trust that some women put into these people to look after their babies, certainly, it's linked to it. Essentially, the Magdalene laundries were baby farming on a bigger scale, and they got away with it. They got away with it for years, and we're still discovering the atrocities that occurred there even today. So yeah, I think so. I think Mrs. Spires is of that ilk, but she's a backstreet version.
Okay, I hope that resolves the question. And yes, I think it does. I have another question, but it is more related towards the Victorian naturalism. Since Esther embodies naturalism and kind of demonstrates social determinism, on the other hand, we have Culwick's life, which kind of demonstrates a negotiation between agency. What does this tells us about the limits of Victorian naturalism as a literary mode?
Mm. So obviously, George Moore was writing from what he could see, and he couldn't see extraordinary people like Hannah Culwick every day. She was quite unique. He was writing in a generalized way, and so I think that that sort of the ability of any writer to write about realism is limited to what they see and what they know about and what they can observe in daily life. And Moore was very, very into you observe and you write it as it is and you don't moralize about it. So that way of writing was a generalization. And in a way that's a very good thing, because that generalization really did apply to so many women, thousands of women. But when it comes to Hannah's story, this is very unique. It is very unique. Lots of women had affairs with men that were above them. Even in my own family, let me get this right now. My great grandmother, I think, was in service, and she had an affair with the son of the household, and she bore a child. The household clearly didn't want to know, and she gave him the name of the father that was the son of the household. She left. This child grew up. She remarried, got a new husband, gave him the new husband's surname. Blah blah blah. The rest is history. So these things did happen massively. And if a woman could, like my great grandmother, I could find a way to then move on from that, then marriage again would potentially help that. But lots of women were left in the gutter, and Esther was left in the gutter in this story, and I think it's so although Moore's writing would be very generalized, it was still the truth for many women around the country, whereas Hannah's was utterly unique.
Thank you so much, Emma. Wonderful presentation. I basically like how you not only combine realism with naturalism while answering becomes question, but also you talked about the entire scenario of the fallen women from a very modern perspective, situating the fallen women trope in today's scenario while talking about your great grandmother. And it's actually truly fascinating how experiences can also be shaped by literary examples. So we are very grateful to have you, and thank you so much for delivering such a well read, such a well organized and enriching and intriguing talk today. We are honored to have you with us, and I think with this we will end our today's discussion. And thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining Emma's session. And yeah, I think with this we will take your leave. Would you like to say anything, Emma?
I'm just thank you so much. It's been lovely. Questions have been very interesting, and it's been a really great afternoon for me. I know it's an evening for you, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rama. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We take your leave now, and we stay tuned. We will see you next Sunday.
Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much, everyone. So now we are ending the session. The lecture will be there available on YouTube. So this will work as an archive. And thank you so much again for joining us and having this wonderful lecture. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.